Hello, welcome to the Hot Seat. I'm Martin Rogers here with Kate Alexander-Shaw to discuss George Osborne's 8th budget. Welcome, Kate.
Hi.
So first of all, can you give us an overview of what we learnt, please?
Well, today's budget statement was quite clearly a big turnaround from the autumn statement and spending review in November of last year. It's clear today that the economic outlook has deteriorated pretty drastically since November. Figures on all sorts of fronts have moved against George Osborne, and that's having some really serious implications for the fiscal position. So today was a much tougher day at the office.
So can you tell us why the economic outlook and the fiscal position have deteriorated since the autumn statement and spending review in November?
Well, there's two things to highlight there, I think, one of which we knew about before Budget Day and the other is more new news. The first is that the ONS's assessment of the size of the UK economy had been downgraded. So it appeared the British economy had done less well last year than had been thought, that the overall size of the economy was somewhat smaller. So that meant George Osborne was starting from a weaker position in the first place, and it has particular implications for his ambition to reduce Britain's stock of debt in relation to the economy year on year. He's actually going to miss that target this year for the first time. Debt will appear to rise somewhat in proportion to the economy, not because the overall debt is rising, it's actually continuing to fall in nominal terms. But because the economy itself had shrunk, as a proportion, that debt is bigger. So that apparent shrinkage in the economy is a big problem. What we also learned today is that the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR's forecasts for growth have been downgraded too, and that's primarily driven, it seems, by weak productivity figures. Productivity has been a sort of structural weakness of the British economy for some years. It's a perennial problem that successive governments talk about cracking and have not yet succeeded in doing. And weak productivity assumptions in this budget model have meant a really significant hit to the growth forecast, whereas in November they were forecasting 2.4% growth for this year. It's now down to 2%. The overall forecast is down 0.3% in each year on average of this Parliament. So that has enormous implications for the fiscal position. Growth
of around 2% year on year for the next few years. Is that a position that George Osborne would be happy with?
No, it is a much weaker position than he'd hoped for. And while on the face of it, coming out of the recession a few years ago, 2% in that context might have been greeted with some enthusiasm, we're now in a very different place. So 2% or just slightly over 2% in the coming years is weaker than you'd hope for an economy in recovery in comparison with historic trends, but more significantly is far weaker than had been forecast even a few months ago. So it's that deterioration in the outlook that, just coming off the heels of an apparently quite favourable spending review, in which Osborne apparently had more room for manoeuvre than he'd expected, that sudden deterioration leaves him in an extremely sticky position on public finances.
So how has George Osborne set out his attempts to match the fiscal position with the targets that he's set?
Well, we're told that there's going to be a further look at where so-called efficiencies can be made. There's going to be a further search for savings across government, and that efficiency review will report in 2018. And apparently they're targeting £3.5 billion worth of savings out of that exercise. It's really significant numbers again. And by doing so, if they can deliver that £3.5 billion, then the surplus is still on by the end of the Parliament, and you end up where Osborne wanted us to be. The politics of that are rather interesting. I mean, being kind of charitable to the Treasury here, they've just completed a spending review in November. Just 2-3 months later, suddenly they're looking for savings in the order of billions again. It's very difficult to simply come up with those. So naturally that process would take some time. And it's hard to imagine that any Whitehall departments are going to be queuing up to offer them further savings on top of the presumably very tight settlements they agreed back in the autumn. But on top of that, it's pretty clear that what's driving the politics this year is the EU referendum, and there would be very limited appetite, I'm sure, for launching a new wave of austerity with lots of very specific measures for the press to report on in the run-up to that referendum. Another set of deeply unpopular choices, which we have to assume they might be. 3.5 billion is going to imply some tough decisions. doing that in the run-up to the EU referendum would put the government in a position of potentially being deeply unpopular, and they're trying to front a campaign for staying in the EU. So you can imagine that wouldn't be something they want to have to deal with in the coming months. Reporting in 2018 puts that at a safe distance from both the referendum and, I guess, they'll be hoping from the next general.
So to move on to discussing the politics of this more fully, Osborne has made a number of fiscal targets, but is it such a bad thing for his reputation if he was to miss these targets, or does the direction of travel matter?
I think it's a really interesting question. On one dimension, it's clearly very important to Osborne that he meets, in particular, this last remaining target to deliver a surplus by the end of the Parliament. He's already breached his welfare cap, as we found out in the autumn statement. It now appears that he's not going to be able to achieve his ambition to reduce debt in proportion to the economy year on year. There will be 1 year in which that target is not met. So the 1 out of 3 that's still on the table is delivering a surplus, and Osborne's really staking his political reputation on that. It's the fixed point around which everything else is having to revolve. So yes, on one level it matters very deeply for both Osborne and for the government as a whole that target is hit. So on the other hand, it is in some ways a sort of symbolic and a slightly technical question whether a surplus is delivered or not. And what matters more to the average person is probably the direction of the government's policy, the overall direction of travel towards further austerity, making inroads into benefit spending and the welfare state. So in some ways, while it's awkward for the government if they technically miss those targets, nonetheless the fact that they set them in the first place has framed the debate in a way that is broadly favourable to the government. It sets the agenda. It says that success, in their terms, is having cut these budgets to the extent that these targets are met, and that failure is failure to cut effectively or failure to balance the books in these ways. So it's actually always been something that sets up more difficult questions for the opposition, for a left-wing opposition, because they have the choice of either criticising the government for not being ruthless enough or trying to have the more difficult conversation with the public about whether these endpoints are actually what people want, whether, for example, another £3.5 billion worth of savings ought to be found, or whether that's now going too far. These are the kind of higher level political questions, and they're quite difficult to work out in public. The existence of these targets frames the debate in a way that narrows it right down.
Prior to the budget, a great deal of expectation management was utilised. There was talk of a very boring budget and a great deal of talking up of the threats to the economy. So was this part of George Osborne's attempt to use political theatre to his advantage?
I think this time out they were playing a weak hand as well as they possibly could. The pattern for the last couple of statements has certainly been to dampen expectations, to trail some potentially unfavourable news in the days running up to the budget, and then keep some things up their sleeve to make it a more positive day. And they still attempted some of those same moves, but it was obviously always going to be more difficult this time given the numbers that they were looking at. So we had quite a lot of build-up about how tough the economic position was going to be. In practice, I think the downgrade in the growth forecast was bigger than anyone expected. So that was always going to be difficult to manage. There were some rabbits out of the hat. The sugar tax was new news. The lifetime ISA is a measure that's guaranteed to get some coverage in the broadsheet. So there are some things in there that ensure some sort of positive announcements on the day after, but I don't think they're going to be enough to knock the overall story out of the way, that this was a difficult position for the government. There were some of the kind of familiar Osborne manoeuvres here. So similarly to the fact that in November he trailed the possibility of cuts to the police budget and then announced with a flourish that it would be frozen, this time there was some speculation that petrol duty might rise very significantly, and he was able to say, no, I'm freezing it again, which is a measure that's guaranteed to be popular with his backbenchers and with the public at large. But nonetheless, those sorts of sweeteners were fewer and further between this time. Sweetness is a bad pun in the context of the sugar tax, but it was a much more difficult day out, and it's pretty clear that the fine print of this one's going to be picked over for quite some time yet.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. You're off the hot seat.
Thank you.